Hello, my name is Demarstein. Welcome to my presentation for advanced writing. Today, we will talk about the impact of a coup d'etat and massacres on African American political and economic power. I found this topic very interesting because of the timeline that we'll go into the presentation. So let's get started. The impact of violence on African American empowerment. So essentially, we're gonna explore this coup, the first and only successful coup in American history, starting in 1898, and we're going to look at a timeline that leads us all the way up to present day. That includes violence to African Americans, both politically and economically, and it also includes resolutions that have been presented by the president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, under the Kerner Report in 1971. We will also talk about the massacre, the coup of Wilmington, North Carolina, and the massacre of Tulsa, Oklahoma of 1921 and the destruction of Black Wall Street. So we will look at a historical context of the coup and the massacres in America and examining the events that have significantly impacted the political and economic landscape for African Americans. So we start with 1898. The Wilmington coup led to violence to overthrow an elected local government, resulting in the disenfranchisement of African Americans. So the Wilmington coup was a starting point, essentially. On an election day, uh, black voters were not allowed to vote, even though we had the right during that time. Um, we were kicked out of our positions. We had some of the highest paid federal workers during that time, in that city specifically speaking. And it was essentially a self-governed city, majority of it being by African Americans. And then we moved to Tulsa, which is 1921, which is the economic heart of Oklahoma and for Black people at that time. Tulsa was a thriving community that was destroyed, which shows the violence that Black citizens face and the destruction of their economic power. It's a very, very interesting place to be. I've went down there and I've visited and I've seen what it looks like now. I've seen photos of what it looks like then. And I've also noticed the difference in the African American communities based on now to then. There's a complete disparity, which is quite interesting to see in person. So we're gonna hop around a little bit. 1971, the Kerner Report identified systematic racism as a root cause of civil unrest, but lacked effective implementation of its recommendations, perpetuating inequality. So you had Lyndon Baines Johnson, president at the time, putting together the Kerner Commission to identify why civil unrest was happening in Black communities. And they came back with a very simple answer. It was racism. It was civil unrest that caused civil unrest. Not only was it racism, but it was the oppression over time of African Americans that caused them to rise up consistently. So we look at a bigger picture, the Wilmington coup of 1898 and the overview and the consequences. And this is a very historic, less known coup. A lot of people don't know that this is the first and only coup to ever happen in the United States of America. But it is very ironic that the coup was to overthrow a largely governed Black city. And a lot of those people that that led that coup but were put into positions of power, politically, in their political careers, including departments of state, including being representatives of Congress, and the list goes on. And so we're going to talk about that. But first, we're going to talk about the violent overthrow of the government. The Wilmington coup involved a violent overthrow led by white supremacists that marked the only successful coup the only successful coup d'etat in U.S. history, resulting in the deaths of many African Americans and the expulsion of Black leaders and political power. This also led to the disenfranchisement of the Black voter. So on election day, Black voters were not allowed to vote. They were shunned away from their own city and being or even being involved in the process. So, following the coup, new laws and practices were implemented to disenfranchise African American voters, including literacy tests and poll tax. This led to a significant reduction in black political representation across the South, effectively silencing their vote for decades. So we want to understand how all of these things connect, and we look at the enduring impact of systematic inequality. The long-term consequences of the Wilmington coup included the establishment of Jim Crow laws that enforced racial segregation and discrimination, further entrenching systematic inequalities that presented for generations and limited economic opportunities for African Americans. So now we talk about Tulsa. Tulsa was or Black Wall Street is referred to, or Greenwood as it is referred to, is or was the economic heart of Black people in the South. Essentially, it was a place where African Americans came to build, to start businesses, to to progress their lives in a positive manner with ownership and equity in what they built. So the attack on Black Wall Street in 1921 saw a white mob violently overthrow the Greenwood district, which was a thriving African American community, and and resulted in the deaths of hundreds of African Americans and destruction of thousands of homes. Which it's also ironic that insurance policies did not pay out to these families or these victims in this case. A lot of people never recovered from that essentially, um, and so that's where Tulsa now stands. Recently, there was a reparations award, which is still controlled by the city. So there's some legal ramifications to that we won't discuss currently, but it's interesting if you are intrigued by the topic. Long-term economic consequences. So the aftermath of the massacre left survivors struggling to rebuild. Uh, Insurance companies did not pay out. And this event highlighted the deep seated racial violence in America and the persistent economic disparities faced by African Americans. So, political and economic impact on African Americans. Historical events have led to systematic inequalities that continue to affect the socio-economic status of African American communities. So a quick turning point in here is in the paper I'm referring to is that we connect the economic, we connect the political, and then we take a little bit of a detour into understanding how systematic oppression also affects the medical realm. And one of the great examples that was used is the Tuskegee experiment, which was conducted from 1932 to 1972, where African Americans were inflicted with syphilis, the sexually transmitted disease, unknowingly and without giving consent, to effectively understand how their bodies progress with the disease. So essentially, African Americans became guinea pigs for scientists during the time and a hotbed for disease based on essentially playing with people's lives, playing with people's health. This experiment lasted from 1931 to 1972, and I actually don't know the results of the study or how they. I don't know, but I should probably look into that because it's still an interesting topic for myself to just research. But the Tuskegee experiment also ties with another experiment, which was the dissection of Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks was a farmer from the 1950s whose cells are alive today, even though her body is gone. Um, her cells are essentially immortal. And her cells, she's an African American woman, and her cells have been used to today in 2025. She died in 1954 to understand so much about medicine. Has helped in cloning, gene mapping, in vitro fertilization, psychogenome therapy. The list goes on. Her cells have helped in so much in modern medicine, and yet African Americans are still not necessarily given the ability to afford the cures that her cells are helping helping to find during this time, and that shows the idea that systematic suppression and white supremacy does not just stop with political and economic might. It also has crept into the medical ethics field. So now we go into Jim Crow. Jim Crow and its lasting impact. Jim Crow enacted the racial segregation, ensured the disenfranchisement of African Americans, perpetuated economic inequalities, had a lasting impact on education, and showed a cultural resilience and resistance for African Americans. So I want to talk about the Kerner Report, which is also identified in my paper. The Kerner Report analysis shows that the government was paying attention to uprisings in Black communities and wanted to figure out why was this happening. Essentially, they identified that a lot of it came from systematic racism, and that caused a lot of civil unrest in the African American communities. This is per the Kerner Report. They recommended changes. It proposed comprehensive measures to address inequality and improve social conditions. However, during that time, because of the other things that the administration was involved in, the Vietnam War, and so on and so forth, it lacked implementation. Despite this findings, little to no action was taken to enact the recommended changes. And the consequences to those changes, or those inactions, I should say, the failure to address the issues have perpetuated racial inequalities and contributed to ongoing social unrest. So now we tie it all to present day. In present day, we have the phenomenon that's been spoken on many times, which is mass incarceration of the African American. So we look at, if you can kind of see the timeline, we start with the 19th century, and that takes us back to the Wilmington coup, where once again, white supremacists led a disenfranchisement and racial violence against Black voters and set the stage for future inequalities. In the 20th century, we had a couple of things that also kicked that up. The Tulsa massacre of 1921 destroyed a Black community that was thriving from economic basis, and that impact was critical for the development of African Americans. Then, around the same time, we have the enactment of the Jim Crow laws, which enacted racial segregation, limiting access to education, employment opportunities, and essentially keeping the foot down on systematic suppression and racism at that time. And then you have 1971, after the Civil Rights Movement, the enactment of civil rights, and Lyndon Baines Johnson decided to do the Kerner Commission, which is the report, which are the people who did the Kerner Report, which identified that systematic racism was a major factor in social unrest, resulting in little action towards meaningful reforms. And then we look at present day. Once the Kerner Report was finished, Lyndon Baines Johnson chose not to run again, and we had a slew of Republican presidents that took office, all of which began to hammer the idea of law and order. Law and order essentially impacted the African Americans even further with the idea of mass incarceration, and that is where present day stands. It has not been addressed fully. So to address historical injustice for future inequality, essentially the idea is for us as a people to have a conversation. These conversations, the Wilmington coup, the Tulsa massacre, the systematic suppression, Jim Crow, medical racism, these are all conversations that society needs to have to ensure that people feel heard, and essentially rectify the wrongs that were done in the past, and inflicted upon African Americans, which has still prevented a lot of African Americans, even to this day, from progression in their own lives. So there's a lot of things to address, and I just want to end here. I want to thank you for your time and being part of the presentation. I hope it was enjoyable for you, and have a good day.